The destruction caused by fighting between Russia and Ukrainian forces battling for control of a town in eastern Ukraine brings back horrors of World War II. That is how the war in Ukraine is going, the scenes of destruction in reference to the town of Soledar. There appears to be no end in sight to this war, with the U.S.-led Western NATO countries pumping as much weapons as they possibly can to Ukraine. In this edition of The Spotlight, we will look at what lies in the horizon for this war and why the U.S. and its allies are really keen on what the Russian president has said, the Ukrainian decision to fight until the last Ukrainian standing. First, let me introduce our guests for this edition of The Spotlight. Ken Stone, Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, joins us from Hamilton, Ontario. Also joining us, Gilbert Doctorow, Independent International Affairs Analyst, who joins us from Muscat. Welcome to you both. I'll first go to you, Ken Stone. Taking a look at this war, let me start with a quote. I think that's best, and then I'll ask the question, instead of me asking the question and then going to the quote. This is what the Ukrainian defense minister has said, Alexei Reznikov. Quote, "We are carrying out NATO's mission today. They aren't shedding their blood. We are shedding ours. That is why they're required to supply us with weapons." My question is Russia fighting Ukraine, or is Russia fighting the U.S. and NATO in Ukraine?
Well, it's very useful that Mr. Reznikov let the cat out of the bag and admitted that in his view, Ukraine is being used as a proxy in the war by NATO, the U.S. and NATO, to destroy the Russian Federation in the manner in which the U.S. and NATO destroyed the Ukrainian Federation about 20 years ago. Russia has been trying valiantly to avoid this war for the last 30 years. But we have been saying from the very start that this war in Ukraine is a U.S. and NATO proxy war. And it started back in 1991, when the U.S. and NATO made promises to Mr. Gorbachev that NATO wouldn't expand even 1 inch east of reunited Germany. And instead, over the past 30 years, it expanded 800 kilometers and took in 14 former Soviet republics and Warsaw Pact states. Then in 2014, the U.S. and NATO, with the connivance of Canada as well, staged a coup in Ukraine and put into power a junta that was riddled with Nazis and which launched a war against the Russian-speaking people in the Donbass. Russia managed, with the help of France and Germany, to bring in the Minsk agreements, which the Ukrainian government admitted. Later, Mr. Poroshenko, and now Mrs. Merkel and Mr. Hollande both chimed in to say it was a ruse to distract the Russians while they turned Ukraine into a de facto NATO state with a de facto NATO army, which they trained to make war on Russia. So from the very start, it's been a U.S. and NATO war on Russia, using Ukraine as the proxy, and the U.S. and NATO don't care about the people of Ukraine. They will fight to the very last Ukrainian.
Okay, so Gilbert Doctorow, a war that really was in the making, and it goes back to, our guest mentioned the date the year 1990, so it was inevitable. Do you agree?
I don't think anything is inevitable. As an historian, I can't accept that proposition, but it became highly likely given the United States' evolving interest in defending its global hegemony, an interest which has become stronger with each year as that hegemony has become more fragile and as it has been threatened openly by the Russians and more recently by the Chinese. So in this context of defending a hegemony that is fragile and is subject to disintegration, the United States made the war inevitable. But as I said, the initial points of how the weakening U.S. position was not necessarily to happen in the last several years as it has.
Taking a look, if I may ask you, Ken Stone, of the military assistance moves by, in particular, the U.S., Germany, and France. Germany Marder fighting vehicles and Leopard tanks, France, armored combat vehicles, and then the U.S., buddy to the Abraham tanks, called Bradley fighting vehicles. Not to mention the missile defense shield, which is another, it's not exactly defensive, it can be offensive also. It just seems like they are upgrading very quickly, I must say, the types of military hardware that they're sending to Ukraine. Why not just send them all at once? What is your reading into the way they're doing it?
Well, I have two things to say. The first is that it's the position of the anti-war movement in Canada that at a time when the world is facing twin existential crises, a world pandemic and the possibility of an environmental collapse, the countries of the world should be cooperating to face these environmental and health threats and not be wasting resources on war. So there should, instead of upgrading and sending more military equipment and more men and more funding to Ukraine, the countries of the West should be looking to sit down and negotiate an end to the conflict. That's the first thing I have to say. The second thing is that these weapons that they're planning to send are too little, too late to save Ukraine. They spent, the West, the NATO and the US, Canada, they spent 8 years building up the Ukrainian army, which is riddled with Nazis, as I mentioned before, as their NATO army in Ukraine. And they built it into they had 3,000 tanks when they started this war. They had over 500,000 men when they started this war. And now they're in a position where they're begging for a few tanks from Russia, from Germany, from France, etc. It's not going to help them because the war is already lost for Ukraine. And you only believe, if you believe the U.S. propaganda, then I'm sorry for you, because the U.S. consistently lies about what it's doing around the world. It lied about Afghanistan, it lied about Iraq, it lied about Vietnam, and it's lying about Ukraine. The Ukrainians have most of their best soldiers are by now sacrificed. Most of their armor is gone, and they have no means of replenishing stocks. And furthermore, they have no means of protecting any of this stuff if the West sends it in. So clearly, what Ukraine should do is sue for peace and make an agreement with the Russian Federation to yield to them the territories that they have claimed and put an end to the conflict. Stop throwing men into the guns as cannon fodder. It's a terrible, terrible sacrifice.
Well, that's a great idea, and I think Zelensky, in his own way, has done that through this 10-point peace plan, Gilbert Doctorow. The problem being that it doesn't want to have those 4 regions where they broke away from Ukraine to be part of, or for it to be related to Russia in any sense. It wants to be part of Ukraine, which is obviously a non-starter when it comes to this. What do you think of that, which has been rejected by Russia? And I guess the other question that comes to mind, Gilbert Doctorow, is does Zelensky speak for Ukrainians when it continues this war?
Well, I'd like to build on what my fellow panelist has said and draw a few conclusions by the events of the last 2 days. The 2 most significant events were the conquest of Soledar, which your opening remarks do not fully take into account because you're relying too heavily on the Ukrainian statements, and the replacement or the placement over the head of the recently appointed Surovikin as overall field commander of the Russian campaign by the Chief of Staff, General Gerasimov, who has now been given general charge for the entire Russian activity in Ukraine. Now, these two developments are indicative of something which answers the opening statements that you made. How long will this war go on? Is it going to go on for weeks, months, years? Not years, and probably not months. And the reason is that the Russians' victory in Soledar, which is similar to the victory they had in the spring in Mariupol, is going to be clear in the next few days. The Ukrainians may say there's street fighting going on, but it's very much like the rearguard action of the Azov battalion in the steelworks in Mariupol. They hold up there, and it took the Russians several weeks to flush them out and to complete the conquest of the city. So it is in Soledar. Soledar in Slavic language is the gift of salt. And that is a city built on salt mines. And one can imagine that there are hard-ranking Ukrainian forces that are holed up in some of those mines and give Mr. Zelensky the reason to say the fighting is going on, which is nonsense. The city is lost, and with the loss of that city, Soledar, the nearby city of Bakhmut that has been contested by the Russians and the Ukrainians, and which has been used by the Russians as bait to stir on succession of Ukrainian attacks that were devastating for the Ukrainian forces and had very few losses for the Russian defenders. These developments have gone on in the last few weeks, and they spell the next steps as the Russians move past the existing Ukrainian defense line and move on to the center of Donbass and take Slavyansk, which is where the whole movement of Donbass liberation started in 2014 in the spring and summer in Slavyansk. So the conquest of Donbass is well in hand. And I think the appointment of Gerasimov to take charge is not, as the Financial Times would have us believe, the result of failed policies, failed maneuvers by General Surovikin. On the contrary, Surovikin has been extraordinarily successful. The appointment of Gerasimov is to prepare the way for the next escalation by the United States when it fully comprehends that the war is lost. The United States may act in an irrational way, and to deal with all potentials of American revenge, Gerasimov is the man in charge who has full control of the Russian military.
Okay, so if I were to understand you correctly, I'm sorry, I have to ask this. So if Soledar is won over by Russia and then comes Bakhmut, and that's taken over, then we are reaching Donbass, and then that will signify the end, or not the end, but the defeat of Ukraine, and therefore the war will stop?
Well, the conquest of Donbass and reaching to the middle of the Donetsk. Just remember that although there are two provinces or oblasts in the Donbass, and Luhansk was virtually completely taken by the Russians and the local militias going back to the spring. But Donetsk was only 50% held by Russians, and the Ukrainian forces were just 2 or 3 kilometers to the west of the capital city of Donetsk on the front line. So this taking of Donbass is all by itself a major change in the war, and it marks the achievement by the Kremlin of its initial war aim. What comes next, we have to see.
We have to see, right.
The spring offensive that smashes the Ukrainian army.
The Americans don't think so, Kent Stone. I mean, I'm looking at the piece of news that's just almost fresh off the press, where the U.S. has announced that it's going to be training the Ukrainians for the Patriot missiles as soon as next week. I think we're in the next week. It will take place at Fort Sill in Oklahoma, where the U.S. conducts its own training and operating and maintaining of advanced air defense systems. So there you have the U.S. And again, every other day practically, we hear about the military assistance that's coming from the U.S. in particular. So the U.S. is not really on the path of wanting this war to end. Isn't that a correct conclusion?
That is a correct conclusion. The U.S. does not want an end to this war. The war could have been ended in March. There was a tentative agreement between the Ukrainian government and the Russian Federation, but Boris Johnson went in there representing the NATO, and he sabotaged that agreement. And the U.S. has no intention whatsoever of ending the fighting, because they think that through this war, this U.S. proxy war on the Russian Federation, that it will, in the words of Chrystia Freeland, our Deputy Prime Minister, the words were vanquish Russia. This war will vanquish Russia, or in the words of General Austin in the White House, it will weaken Russia to the point that it can no longer resist NATO's eastward advance. So the U.S. does not want an end to this war, and they don't care how many Ukrainians die, how many Ukrainians become injured, how many Ukrainians starve in the cold, how many Ukrainians have to flee the country. They will continue to send in arms, and they will continue causing provocations such as the Nord Stream sabotage of the Crimean Bridge, by giving more and more dangerous long-range weapons to Ukraine to be able to bomb places inside Russia proper. They are really
That's an
pushing
interesting thing that you're saying. Yeah, that's an interesting point that you're making there in terms of these missiles that can reach Russia. I'd like to find out from you, Gilbert Doctor, what you make of what the Russian President Vladimir Putin recently announced. And when he made that announcement, he had a smirk on his face, that he sent a frigate equipped with the latest hypersonic cruise missiles towards the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. The most unique in the world, 9 or 10 times the speed of sound, and I think the range is 1,000 kilometers or more. Now, who and to where is that a message for? Is it to the U.S. that has warships out where it sent it to? Or is that a message overall to Ukraine that we can target anywhere, you can't stop us, not with the missile defense shield, not with anything, because these are the type of missiles that Russia has?
Well, Russia has several hypersonic missiles. Some are airborne or air-carried by strategic bombers, and some are, as in the case of the Zircon missile that was mentioned by Mr. Putin on the frigate Admiral Gorshkov. They are sea carried. They can be carried by frigates, which is the way the launch that Putin was describing took place. They can be launched from submarines, Russian submarines, at 30 to 40 meters below the surface. We will note that NATO countries are following closely the progress of the Gorshkov as it makes its way from Murmansk into the seas where it will be operating. And it today was past the English Channel. It's on its way into the Atlantic. That frigate is entirely capable of striking not only naval objects, which is its major design purpose, but also to destroy land targets. As it approaches the middle of the Atlantic, it would be quite capable of posing a direct threat to American cities, unstoppable as it is. I think this falls in line with what I said a moment ago, to understand what the Russians are doing in conducting the war by appointing Gerasimov, their chief of staff, as the operating responsible officer for the entire Ukrainian operation. The purpose is to put on notice the United States and NATO that Russia is prepared for any possible escalation by the US and NATO in response to the pending victory on the ground of Russian forces in Ukraine.
Given that point of view, Ken Stone, I'm going to go to your way of thinking and what you proposed, which I think is a great proposal, and that's what we're going to end the program on.